The fundamentals of instructing. This module will cover the theory and practical knowledge required to teach and get you closer to becoming a certified flight instructor. This module will cover learning and teaching theories. This lesson will go into detail about the steps to become a certified flight instructor and how to present yourself to the student. We'll also cover students' behaviors and how to recognize and deal with students' needs. We will cover the different teaching tools that will help you present your training material to the student and allow you to tailor your lessons to the student's learning style. Along the way, you'll also learn how to structure proper critiques of your students' progress and create and design effective lesson plans. When you become a flight instructor, you will already have good piloting skill, but may lack the ability and practical psychology to teach well. Remember, you are teachers first and pilots second. Your role will be not only to demonstrate maneuvers, but to teach the knowledge behind the maneuvers. The FAA assumes you can fly competently at the commercial pilot level. We want to make sure you will be prepared to teach students at the private, commercial, sport, and recreational level. Human behavior. In this section, we will discuss human behavior. As a species, we can say that humans exhibit certain behavior traits that are common with other humans. Understanding these are necessary to begin to understand differences in each student you will have. This section provides the underpinning so you can tailor your teaching to any student. This is Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. It basically shows how you need certain basic needs met before you can learn or grow. Let's look at the bottom of this pyramid up. Physical needs state that a person is first concerned with the need for food, rest, and protection from the elements. As an instructor, monitor your students and make sure they are not tired or hungry, or their performance will suffer. Safety is the need for protection against danger, threats, and deprivation. The student will not be able to learn a task with a war going on around them or in a building that they may feel unsafe in. The social need is the need to belong, to associate, and to give and receive friendship and love. A partner in a marriage may want to learn to fly for the sole reason that their spouse flies and they want to be included. The ego need has two types: those that relate to one's self-esteem, such as confidence, independence, achievement, competence, and knowledge, and the needs that relate to one's reputation, such as status, recognition, appreciation, and respect of associates. Last in the hierarchy is self-fulfillment. This includes realizing one's own potential for continued development and for being creative in the broadest sense of the term. As an instructor, you will have the task of helping your students get to fulfillment. Here's an acronym to help remember the needs. Phil said, so eggs see. It may not work for everyone, but Phil is for physical, SED is for safety, SO for social, eggs for egoistic, and C for self-fulfillment. Your students at times can exhibit defense mechanisms towards their performance. Here are some of the more common ones. Compensation is an attempt to disguise the presence of a weak quality by emphasizing a more positive one. For example, my landing was soft, but I didn't correct for the crosswind and almost went off the runway. Projection. Students relegate blame for their own shortcomings or mistakes. They may say, well, my roommate's instructor sets lower tolerances for this maneuver. Rationalization permits them to substitute excuses for reasons. Moreover, they can make those excuses plausible and acceptable to themselves. They will believe in their own excuses, and the excuses will seem real and justifiable to the individual. Denial of reality may happen when a student chooses to ignore or refuse to acknowledge disagreeable realities. They may choose to ignore any criticism you give them on their performance. This is usually more profound in more experienced pilots. Reaction formation. This is a who cares what other people think attitude to cover up feelings of loneliness and hunger for acceptance. Students protect themselves from dangerous desires by not only repressing them, but by actually developing conscious attitudes and behaviors that are just the opposite. A student who wants to escape from frustrating situations may take flight physically or mentally. When a student removes themselves from frustrating situations, more often than not, this will take the form of flight. It is most realized by a student who is daydreaming. Aggression in students is emotional and is due to them having some other problem they may need to deal with. If students cannot deal directly with the cause of their frustration, they may vent their aggressiveness on a neutral object or a person not related to the problem. In the airplane, they may abruptly handle the flight controls or become aggressive towards you. Make sure they try to resolve the issue as safely as possible and deal with the problem on the ground as soon as possible. Resignation is when the student becomes so frustrated they may lose interest and give up. They accept defeat and may not find it possible or profitable to go on. When you're an instructor, you'll become acquainted with many different reactions to training. Some of the common ones are anxiety, normal reactions to stress, and abnormal reactions to stress. Anxiety results from the fear of anything, real or imagined, which threatens the person who experiences it. This may have a potent effect on actions and the ability to learn from perceptions. Student anxieties can be minimized throughout training by emphasizing the benefits and pleasurable experiences which can be derived from flying, rather than continuously citing the unhappy consequences of faulty performances. Instructors may experience anxiety most when they have a student soloing because they are worried they have missed something. Normal reactions to stress occur when a threat is recognized or imagined and the brain alerts the body. The adrenal gland activates hormones which prepare the body to meet the threat or to retreat from it. This often is called flight or flight syndrome. Many responses are automatic, which points out the need for proper training in emergency operations prior to an actual emergency. The affected individual thinks rationally, acts rapidly, and is extremely sensitive to all aspects of the surroundings. You may have to tell the student that it is normal that the ground is coming up at them fast on landing, and it may take some time for them to learn to get used to that sensation. When a student is reacting abnormally to stress, they may start singing, over-cooperating with the flight controls, or their responses may be random or illogical. They may also do more than is called for by the situation. A flight instructor who believes a student may be suffering from a serious psychological abnormality has a responsibility to refrain from certifying that student. Don't wait until solo time to do the evaluation on the student. When the student shows signs of disqualifying psychological defects, arrangements should be made for another instructor who is not acquainted with the student to conduct an evaluation flight. After the flight, the two instructors should confer and determine whether they agree that further investigation or action is necessary. A discussion should be held with a local aviation medical examiner, preferably the one who issued the student's medical certificate, to obtain advice and decide on the possibility of further examination of the student. Lastly, an informal discussion should be initiated with the local Flight Standards District Office, suggesting that the student may be able to meet the skill standards, but may be unsafe psychologically. This action should be taken as soon as questions arise regarding the student's fitness. It should not be delayed until the student feels competent to solo. The learning process. Here, we will begin to look at how people learn. It will give you a lot of insight into how people move information from working memory to long-term memory and how we can help accelerate learning. Learning is a persistent change in behavior achieved from experience with the environment which cannot be attributed to natural growth. So what does this mean? Take, for example, a child who touches a hot stove and gets burned. From the experience they learn touching the stove, their behavior is consequently changed. A person who learns to fly is changing their behavior as a result of experiences encountered during flight training. There are two theories about learning. We will first consider behaviorism theory. Behaviorism theory suggests that all humans learn in basically the same manner and will respond to their environment in predictable ways. It is also thought that behaviors can be learned. Cognitive theory involves mental processes such as decision-making and problem-solving, which are difficult, if not impossible, to observe and measure. It is difficult and sometimes impossible to determine if learning has taken place. There are two models of cognitive theory. They are social interaction and cognitive information processing. Students learn to shape their conduct after observing behavior displayed in their environment. As a flight instructor, you should be careful of the way you are perceived doing things, as this can be considered prevailing behavior from the student. Cognitive information processing relates to how information is gathered, processed, and stored by the brain. Both of these agree on enforcing the behavior of the student so he can change that behavior. The body's sensory organs, which detect sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, receive incoming information. The sensory register filters out irrelevant information in less than a second through the process of attending. Working memory codes information for storage in less than a minute through the process of conscious thought. When we take what's left in the sensory register and we put it in short-term memory, we then process it. Long-term memory can store information for a lifetime and performs a reconstructive process. Let's start by perceiving things. Perceptions occur when meaning is given to sensations. The perceptions that your students will learn won't mean anything until there is understanding of the sensation they're experiencing. Perceptions are the basis of all learning. For example, the sensation of a gear horn or the stall horn has no meaning to a student until they learn the sound they are hearing corresponds to the action that has occurred. Only then can the student do the necessary task to correct that action. Perceptions are based on how people expect things to be. Students left unguided will make incorrect perceptions and may develop bad habits and learn incorrect data. A good example is, after repeated practice of engine failures, your student expects that when the power is reduced, the horn will sound off. When returning to the airport, the student decreases the power to slow the airplane for landing and neglects to lower the landing gear. A horn sounds, and the student perceives the horn to be associated with a reduction in power only. Factors that influence perceptions. There are factors which influence students' perceptions. The student has to be able to use all of their senses to perceive the data that's being presented. They need to have an intact physical organism to do that. This means in general that they need all of their senses to form accurate perceptions. An individual will be denied a medical when their perceptual apparatus distorts reality at the time of the first medical examination. The physical organism must have the ability to perceive with all senses. Basic need is both physical and psychological. A person's most fundamental pressing need is to preserve and perpetuate the self. It is difficult to perceive when basic needs are not met. Helping people learn requires finding ways to aid them in developing better perceptions in spite of their defense mechanisms. A student's self-image has great influence on the total perceptual process. The self-concept addresses how a student feels about him or herself. If a student's experience tends to support a favorable self-image, the student tends to remain receptive to subsequent experiences. If a student has negative experiences which tend to contradict self-concept, there is a tendency to reject additional training. Perceptions also depend on one's goals and values. If a student feels afraid of flying solo even after solo flight, what will most likely happen is the student will quit aviation altogether and pick up another hobby. Another example would be a student that flies better than most pilots with his experience level, but as soon as you get out to solo, the student becomes shaky and nervous and doesn't want to continue. Poor performance in solo flight then deters him from continuing his training. Students' goals and values may become affected when they perform poorly. Time and Opportunity states that the more time a student is able to put into flying, the more the student will be able to get out of it. Having 2 lessons a week instead of having only 1 a week will not only mean a quicker path for the student achieving their goals, but the knowledge learned from the last lesson will still be fresh and less time will be needed to spend on review. When a student is perceiving that the action they are doing can be a threat to their survival, they will tend to react in a way that may be contradictory to what you may be trying to teach them. This is the element of threat which will narrow their perceptual field. A good example is when a student is learning to flare. After the approach phase on final, they will see the ground coming up rather quickly. Their reaction will most likely be to start leveling off too high. This will slow the airplane down several feet off the runway and cause it to potentially stall. This is happening because the student is fixating on a single task and is narrowing their perceptual field. As they get more practice, they will open up their perceptual field and begin to see other elements which make flaring the airplane easier. A good instructor tip to get them not to flare so high is to have the students look down the runway when coming into ground effect. They can use their depth perception to judge the height of the runway, saving them time and you possibly a headache. Insights are made by grouping individual perceptions. To create insight, it is important to keep each student continually receptive to new experiences and to realize how it all comes together in the big picture. You have to group perceptions into meaningful wholes. An example is during straight and level flight in an airplane with a fixed pitch propeller, the RPM will increase when the throttle is open and decrease when it's closed. On the other hand, RPM changes can also result from changes in airplane pitch attitude without changes in power setting. Obviously, engine speed, power setting, airspeed, and airplane attitude are all related. As the number of perceptions increase, opportunities for the student to gain insight increases. Discussions with models, demonstrations, and so on help anchor perceptions into insights. Earlier, we said that we have a sensory register, that is where our incoming information lands first. We also said the sensory register can filter what is important and what is not. Humans have the ability to do something called selectively attending. This is the ability to sort through enormous amounts of sensory input while ignoring the rest. What this means is that if you are in a loud environment, you may have the ability to have selective hearing. When students can perform routine tasks, you can begin to introduce more complex maneuvers. When a procedure is learned to the point that it becomes habit, the sensory register monitors the activity while letting the student think about new information being presented. Attending can be a positive in sorting through enormous amounts of information, like listening to radio communications while performing maneuvers and screening any calls that do not have your tail number in it. When the student learns to selectively attend, they can do more complex tasks. It's the job of the instructor to help students learn. Knowledge is information we are consciously aware of and can articulate. There are 3 phases of knowledge progression. The first is memorization. Memorizing facts and procedures can be beneficial. It lets the student get started quickly. Of course, the limitations of memorization are soon realized when you have to put this knowledge to unscripted scenarios or tasks. Next comes understanding. The student can answer questions about what they've memorized. Understanding comes when students start organizing facts and procedures into coherent groupings that form an understanding of how something works. Concept learning has its basis in that humans tend to group things together that make sense to do so. By grouping, students minimize the complexities of life and create a manageable set of categories. Students learn at a higher level when they are concept learning. There are levels of learning that can help you understand where a student is and what they have learned. Most people start at the bottom, at the rote level, and they proceed to the 4 levels of learning to a point called correlation, where they can apply what they've learned to other tasks not yet seen before. Let's take a look at them now. Rote. It's basically like monkey see, monkey do. It means the learner can duplicate what you're saying and what you're doing, but may have no idea what he is actually doing. Understanding. The student may not be able to perform the skill yet, but they understand the reasons behind it. Application. The person can actually perform the skill and understand why they're doing it. Correlation. Correlation is taking the knowledge learned and applying it to another area of learning. Correlation is achieved in the airplane. When you're designing or creating questions, you should remember that rote questions will start with what, understanding questions will start with why or how, application questions begin with describe or explain, and correlation questions are scenario-based questions. The laws of learning. The laws of learning really start to explain the importance of structuring well-planned lessons. Violating a law of learning is sure to cause the experience or lesson to be less effective or, in the worst case, learned incorrectly. Let's look at the 6 laws of learning. The first law is a law of readiness. The student has to be ready to learn. Whether they have decided to learn for themselves or for someone else, the student has to come prepared and motivated to learn. The next law is that of exercise. You have to make sure that your student practices what is learned. The more they do an exercise, the more likely they are to remember. The law of effect is what effect the instruction has on your student. The more favorable the lesson, the better the information will be learned. The law of primacy states that whatever is learned first will be most remembered. So teach your students correctly the first time. The law of intensity means that the more realistic the experience is, the better it will be learned. An example would be using an airplane when teaching the student how to flare instead of using a regular desktop simulator. The airplane would be more beneficial to the student because it provides the most realistic representation of the landing flare. The last law is the law of recency. This states the more recent the information was presented, the better that information will be remembered. The domains of learning. There are 3 domains of learning. They are the cognitive domain, psychomotor domain, and affective domain. The cognitive domain is the knowledge side and is gained as a result of attending ground school, like this one. Reading, listening to a pre-flight briefing, or participation in computer-based training strengthens this domain. The psychomotor domain is the physical skills and ability to maneuver and manipulate things. Physical skills involve more than muscles, like the skill to manipulate an airplane. The desire to learn and an ability to follow patterns is strong. A pattern example is slow flight. Maintain the wings level, maintain a level attitude, flaps 10, and so on. Knowledge of the results means the mistakes are pointed out to the student. Students always follow a pattern. They start learning steeply, plateau, then rise at the end. The affective domain is your beliefs and attitudes. It addresses a learner's emotion towards the learning experience. You will need to analyze how your student approaches learning. Find out if your student is motivated to learn and if they have an overall positive attitude towards safety. The characteristics of learning. There has to be a reason to learn, or the information will be thrown out. If it's not on the test, for example, it will most likely be tossed out. As an instructor, you have to give a reason for your student to want to learn the information. So make the information purposeful. Learning will result from an experience like physically flying an airplane. It comes from different elements and contains verbal, conceptual, perceptual, and motor problem solving. It is also multifaceted. An example is when someone is taxiing to the runway and the student notices another aircraft stops at the hold short bars and asks why the aircraft stopped where it stopped. Without even the instructor's input, the student will learn what the hold short bars are for. Whether the information learned that way is correct is up to you to make sure of. The last characteristic, an active process, means the student has to participate and engage in the learning process. The more motivated the student is, the more they will learn, which correlates to them participating actively. Learning styles. People with either right or left brain dominance can work and become pilots. However, it may be more difficult for you and your student to learn when there's a difference in learning styles. Reflective people will think things through, while impulsive types will act on impulse. This means that they act before thinking most of the time. A holist is a person that learns from the top down. They have to receive the big picture from end to end so they can see the end of the road. A serialist is a person who learns better by taking it step by step and concentrating on one stage at a time. Auditory learners learn easily by listening. Visual learners use their eyes, and kinesthetic learners learn by doing. Kinesthetic learners usually make good stick and rudder pilots, but suffer from the lack of knowledge pertaining to flying. It will help you teach your students better if you figure out what type of learner they are and adjust your lessons to benefit them most. Students learn in different ways and acclimate to styles they like best. Some are top-down thinkers, some use more of one side of the brain than the other, some prefer video, and some learn only by doing. Let's look at some of the learning styles that are common in the flight training environment. Holists and serialists. Holists use top-down information strategy to process information. Holists like to study several parts of a lesson simultaneously and seek to understand both theory and practical applications at the same time. Serialists use bottom-up strategy. Serialists prefer to start at the beginning and examine material in order. Each piece of information is linked to others to eventually create an overall view. Auditory and visual learners. Auditory learners learn best by listening. They may need to talk about a topic to hear their own thoughts. They may also have to verbalize what they're thinking. They tend to achieve higher grades in traditional settings. Visual learners learn best by pictures and not by a series of build-ups. They are conceptual and global in learning preferences. You must ensure that they have a clear understanding of the overall objective and where the lesson is heading. Kinesthetic learners prefer to be doing something and get information from hands-on experience. Kinesthetic learners should be asked to demonstrate things rather than answer multi-choice tests. Typically, they are great stick and rudder pilots. Reflective and impulsive students. Reflective students consider all possibilities before making a decision. The benefits are that when a reflective student comes to the answer, it will usually be the right one. The disadvantage to a reflective student can be their decisions will take too long. Impulsive students make quick assessments, then decide. The benefit of an impulsive student is they will make a quick decision, but the disadvantage is that it may be wrong. One will be more dominant in a student over the other. Which one are you? Brain dominance theory. According to the brain dominance theory, the left is responsible for verbal, analytical, and objective thinking. The right side is creative, intuitive, and emotional. What this theory states is that you are more of one than the other. Each side of the brain can learn to replicate the information learned on the other side of the brain to a certain extent. Right brain dominant students are spatially oriented, meaning they are coordinated, creative, intuitive, and emotional. These types of students are good in art, music, and can easily put together the big picture. Left brain students are verbal, analytical, and objective. The student is good in math, language, and analyzing details. This type of student will be asking the most amount of questions.